So one of the challenges for us is how do we represent our collection once a year and do it in a way that isn't just sort of a smorgasbord, selections from the collection. You can always do that. Those shows are legitimate, but what we try to do is figure out, are there some themes or some connections we can create by bringing certain objects together that will tell a story in a way that's meaningful and instructive for our audiences. And so, looking at higher ground and realizing the important influence of the landscape for artists in East Tennessee, it seemed really natural for us to look at our collection and try to pull together works that have some kind of connection to the external world, whether it's a wilderness environment, an urban environment, whether the scene is imagined, perceived, whether it's fragmented, whether it's descriptive. And so that became the common thread for the Uncertain Terrain exhibition. Next slide, please. What we've tried to do is organize the show. When I put a show together, I love making sure that the artwork looks like it's all getting along well in the space, that each work has its own elbow room, so to speak, and that the curatorial idea or thesis doesn't create a show that really looks awkward. So that's one thing, but I was trying to come up with groupings where you have certain objects that seem to be coming from a similar agenda. And so one is invented landscapes that deal with multiple sites or locations. Next slide. And as you walk in the gallery, there are a couple examples of that. One of them is Natasha Kissel's Wolf Shadow. And it's a work that, on first glance, might appear to be a specific location, a ski resort in Colorado, maybe in the Alps. Kissel is a London-based artist who came out of a family. I think her father was a modern architect. And so most of her paintings have some kind of a modernist structure. Many of them are far more grand than this small chalet. And usually she'll pit these against the grandeur of nature, so the civilization-nature balance. And in this work, what you realize in looking closely is that she's taking all these little fragments and stitched them together in a way that makes you think on first glance that this may be a real location, but the sense of scale and recession is way off. You've got this strange little cluster of wolves right here while this car is speeding away. Things that wouldn't normally happen. And then the tidal wolf shadow, if you look closely, you'll see the shadow right here. Next image. Chuck Forsman. This is a painting called Park that's been in our collection for quite a while. And one of the key groups that has helped us build our collection to the point where we can have a show like Uncertain Terrain is our Collector's Circle group. And Chris handed out some sheets with information for those of you who are interested in joining. But it's basically a group of individuals who are KMA members at a certain level or above, who they don't necessarily consider themselves serious collectors, but they are interested in helping the museum collect. Some of them do own artwork. Some of them are pretty avid collectors. And what they do is, with their membership dues, we have a pool of funds each year. We get them together, and we've selected a handful of works of art for them to purchase for the museum. And this is one of the early ones that we acquired several years ago. And Forsman is an artist who works out in Colorado primarily, and he'll visit all kinds of national park settings all over the West, and will take lots of photographs and come back to his studio, and he'll compose a whole new reality based on bits and pieces of scenes that he's gathered elsewhere. And so, again, a scene that's very carefully described. The brushwork is very even and detailed. He's even created a custom frame that defies that rectangular or square standard. And it's really meant to evoke our feelings about humanity's interaction with nature. We see scars of civilization, and yet the title of the work is Park. And so you're wondering, again, what's the artist's agenda? But it's clear that he's trying to get us to think about the intersection of civilization and nature out west. Next image. Another artist whose work fits neatly into this section is Tom McGrath. He was a late addition to the show. He's actually an artist-in-resident alum from the University of Tennessee. And he's not originally from East Tennessee, but he spent a lot of time here. And he did a body of work based on nighttime drives through East Tennessee and over into Middle Tennessee. And these were two paintings I saw over at UN Gallery at a show he had that I thought would be a terrific fit, because what he's done here is these are both fairly small. he will take all these photographs in the car at night while he's driving through the landscape. And he'll go back to the studio and paint very freely from these photographic snippets. And if you look carefully upstairs after the talk, you can see some of it here. The painting technique changes from square inch to square inch. Right here, he's left a lot of bare canvas. You've got what looks to be almost a flashbulb-like washout effect on the trees here. Over here, these trees have a lot of depth to them. There's a lot more color. And down here, it's all become just sort of abstract passages. Same thing here. You'll see a stand of trees. Then it appears like there's a whole other landscape stacked on top of this landscape. And this one's much wetter and looser, almost like you're looking through a windshield when it's raining. And you'll also notice some odd, unnatural contours right here and right here. And those are, in fact, the contours of a passenger side window. So he's trying to recreate a whole different experience of the landscape than what we're used to when we think about traditional American landscape painting. And this is very much a landscape in flux, and a landscape that, as he would say, it's the way we tend to see the outdoors these days. We're always in a car. We're not stopping to get out and really interact. Next slide. David Hilliard, Knoxville Summer. This is also a work that was acquired by the museums. I think it was Collector Circle several years ago. Was it? Or was it out of Artscapes? I forgot. I wasn't here at the museum.
I think it was Artscapes.
Yeah.
I wasn't here at the time, but I was pleased to see this work in the collection when I came back from the museum in 2006. And this is a scene taken on the backside of Fort Dickerson in South Knoxville. And I don't know if you can tell from the slide, but it's broken into 4 separate panels that are all hung side by side. And Hilliard is an artist who enjoys exploring this sequential format. And when you look at this, you might think, well, there's really not a whole lot fragmented about this. It seems to flow together pretty well. But what he's doing is he's really composed this scene. He's asked this guy to compose for him and had him stand here with the crystal cup and told this guy to go back there. He's very much like a film director orchestrating this scene. So there's a level of artificiality about it. The other thing, too, is that by breaking it up into these sequences, it gives you the sense of almost a step-by-step progress in the film. He's also making subtle adjustments in our distance from the subject matter. Here we're more zoomed into the kudzu. Here he sort of pulled us back. You can see this tree appears in this frame as well as in that frame, almost like a little stutter step. And so in this way, he's, again, working with fragmenting and bringing together images from various locations, even if those locations are only a few inches away. Next slide. Okay, let's go on to the slide after this. There are several works in our collection that deal with artists who are looking at the external world but are somehow translating that and reducing it down to individual points of synthetic data, such as this work by Jim Campbell. We did a show of his work 2004-2005, and he enjoys working with LED light-emitting diode technology and with film. He's primarily a filmmaker. What he'll do is he'll take his films and will reduce them and program them so that they become 192 points of light on this small resin screen. And when you look at this, what happens is your brain ends up fighting to sort of fill in the blanks. You know that there is moving imagery. You can see patterns of movement that you recognize. And what he's doing is he's giving our brains just enough information to be able to correlate what's actually happening. And in the case of this work, reconstruction number 4, it's basically filmed from the streets of Manhattan 4 days after 9/11. And he was aware of the different rhythms and movements on the street after the tragedy, and so he captured those on film and then reproduced those in this work. Next image. And then here's a work that's one of the largest in our collection. It's 31 feet 5 inches wide, and that's a very important measurement because that is exactly the width of our wall in our downstairs gallery for which this specific work was designed. We did a show of Westergren's work here several years ago, and she designed that specific piece to fit that wall. And one of the real moments of anxiety for me with the Uncertain Terrain exhibition is that I wanted the crew to put this work in the gallery above where that wall exists. And so it didn't occur to me until the crew was putting up the work, what if the architect's measurements are a little bit off? Yes, it hits the wall directly upstairs, but if it's 31 4 3/4, will all the panels that this sequin composition is mounted on, they all fit? Fortunately, I got up there right as they were putting one of the last panels, and I saw that it fit beautifully, and so I just praised the architect. He does very good. But Westergren is a Scandinavian-born artist who now lives in this country, and she's very much inspired by her Nordic heritage and by fairies and myths. And this is a monumental composition on individual square panels of foam core that are attached to the wall. And then there are these large bluish, greenish, silvery sequins that have been pinned into a regular grid on each one of those panels and then assembled to produce this large shimmering scene of an iceberg. And what's great is if you're up there and the air handlers kick on, the sequins shimmer, and it's really pretty magical. You'll see it reflected in the floor as well. Next image. Here's another work that deals with fragmentary bits of data. These bits are natural, though. These are sections of a tree that was cut down and provided for the artist. She's an artist from Hawaii and is very much inspired by the surrounding landscape and is also interested in America's landscape painting tradition, how that tradition was so much focused on presenting nature in this country as wilder and more vast than anything in Europe, in the old world, and at the same time how it was inexhaustible. And what Moritsugu realizes, living in the age that she lives in, is that it isn't inexhaustible. And she herself is living on a small island out there in the middle of the Pacific. And so what she's done is she's taken the style, if we go to the next slide please, the style of the Hudson River School master painters from the 18th century, 19th century, and she's applied that to these individual tree sections with the bark still on them in a way that reminds us that we don't have a complete view of nature, and that nature is vanishing. There are parts of it that are irreplaceable, and that these scenes, which are part of the larger scene that can never connect, that's again a sign of our impact on nature. And if you stand to the one side or the other of this particular work, it almost appears to be a clear-cut forest. These sections being painted on individually. And she has a big diagram that we have to follow, and each one of these tree sections is fitted onto a nail. And so first we put this big film on the wall with individual drawings of the position of each log. We have to pull the logs out of this crate with foam inserts, match each one up. So it's a labor-intensive work to hang. But it's been a very popular addition to our collection. Next slide. Okay, slide after this. Our collection includes very few abstract works, and so one of the things we've really been excited about is being able to build in this area with some recent purchases and acquisitions. We purchased this painting by Jared Sprecher, who's on faculty at the University of Tennessee and has been doing some really exciting work in the area of abstraction. And one of the things I encourage you to do when you look at Jared's work is get up close to it, see what he's doing on the surface. He's working with so many different painting techniques. There's spray paint here. He's laying paint down with large brushes and squeegeeing it. He's got tape that's been laid down and peeled up. The surface is just really alive with all kinds of detail that's there for someone that has the time and the patience to look carefully. You might look at this and not see a landscape here, but I think of his work as being very much landscape-based in terms of trying to create an abstract, geometric, pictorial space that you can go through with your eye. You've got planes that recede in the distance. You've got actual imagery based on architectural drawings and doorways that appear to lead you in, but then you've got these X's that appear to block you out. These structures also refer back to some other works of Jared's that are based on emerald-cut diamonds, just these gargantuan paintings of diamonds, and they're really beautiful. This, in fact, this arrow shape is based on some imagery we saw in the art and architecture building. Some student had taped these arrows onto a column, and Jared, again, is just borrowing from his external environment all these motifs and combining them in compositions that pull from art history as well as daily life in the studio. Next slide. A work that I think is in some ways harmonious with Jared's, aesthetically in some ways, but in terms of process couldn't be more different, is this work by Richard Galpin called Cluster Cirrhosopolis, making reference to science and cloud formations. He has an unusual technique. What he does is he'll take his own photographs of an urban center, New York, London, where he's from, or wherever, and he'll go back to his studio and lay out these large color prints. And with a scalpel, he will go in and delicately and precisely cut away and peel off the emulsion, leaving a completely reconfigured scene. And in some cases, he will follow the contours of maybe a particular building's facade. In other cases, he may completely change the angles of emphasis. And so when you look at the final work, it looks like a conceptual geometric abstraction. This is, in fact, an image of Times Square.
I didn't realize we bought these.
We didn't.
Oh.
We didn't. There are some pieces that you're going to see in Uncertain Terrain, like the two tomograph paintings. I should have pointed out, those are not ours, but one of them may become ours. This is a new wrinkle that we've tried with Uncertain Terrain. With Arlene's comment, it's a perfect opportunity for me to explain this. That one of the things we try to do with our exhibitions is create acquisitions opportunities. And so with Uncertain Terrain, one of the things we did was bring in a couple of borrowed pieces, hoping that during the course of the show, money might be raised. Someone might say, you know, I'll help you buy this work. And that has happened. This is one work that our collector circle group looked at and did not vote on, but I'll get to some other ones later that we did vote on. Let's move to the next slide.
Oh, I had a question.
Oh, let's go back there. Question?
Yeah, is that the photograph with the emulsion removed, or does he then paint a separate one? That's
There's no paint at all. It's simply, you're looking at the photograph.
It's a color photo?
So, yes, and basically everywhere that's white, that is the paper that's underneath the emulsion. Matter of fact, if you look really closely, you'll even see little clues where bits of paper have been torn. He doesn't want to hide his process. Next slide. And this was a work that I was really excited by. It's a work by a guy that I actually knew shortly after I came to the museum. He was an elderly guy who had a fantastic collection. And he never told me about his own art. And I saw examples of his painting at some other museums in town. And then when I was going through an estate, and some paintings were being offered to us, I saw this painting, and the woman who gave it to us said, I have no idea who this guy is, and I recognize the signature, but I'd never seen anything he had done that was other than a representational landscape. This is the only abstract piece of his I'd ever seen. And yet, to me, it really spoke of a nighttime urban setting that had been maybe devastated by fire, by something. It made me think about Picasso's Guernica. And Robert Van de Venner is a guy that, again, I wish he were alive. I wish I could ask him questions about why he didn't tell me he was an artist, and what were the ideas behind this painting. I mean, I think he was in World War II, if I'm not mistaken. He served, and he may have seen the bombing of who knows what city, and those memories stayed with him. But this is a fabulous painting that is abstract, but yet it suggests a structure torn apart by some kind of devastating force. All the angles, the diagonals, the bright fiery colors against the cool nighttime colors. It's one that I think is really a jewel.
Was he like friends with the other beauty guy? You know, like Carl Sutherland?
He seems to be an enigma. There are a lot of people that know of him, but I think he was a loner. I think he was someone that did his work in his home, was very humble about it. I mean, when I was with him, it was like he was almost apologizing for encroaching on my schedule and my time and bring me over to show me these amazing watercolors by Sir William Russell Flint that were better than anything I saw in the Little collection.
Yeah.
You know, and he was just that kind of guy.
But maybe he was, you know, going to shows at UT, do you think? Or
it could be.
knows?
He struck me as someone that may have gone to museums in Europe. I mean, he was a very understated but sophisticated person.
I mean, it is, I agree with you, it is very, I mean, even with students.
Definitely.
You know what I mean? You just see, but I know there was a time when there was a lot of really good abstraction being done around Knoxville.
And my other frustration with this is I don't know what the exact date is. I put circa 1950, giving honor to Stevens and Sublette, the energy going on around here, but If it were dated 1938, I'd be even more excited because that would really predate any kind of work being done in Knoxville. It would be a really forward-looking example of work by a Knoxville artist. Next slide. Elemental landscapes. Next slide. By that, really what I meant was images by artists who were trying to sort of distill the external environment down to its most basic aspects. Like if you want to put it bluntly, heat, cold. I mean, just using color to suggest reflection on scorched landscape. Tommy Dodge is an artist who has a great way with paint. If you look at this canvas, there's so much happening on the surface. He's laying it on almost like he's trying to put the icing on a cake. He's using different kinds of implements to lay down the paint. Up here, it's fairly sort of scraped on. Down here, it's shoveled on practically. And what he said about this painting was that he was intrigued by the fact that you could use abstract color, just pure color out of the tube, in a way that suggested a natural visual phenomenon. And so that's really what this is all about, using those spectral colors in a way that if you were to try to blend color like Darren Waterston does, you can never really suggest a mirage, but because those pure colors being laid down side by side, it really suggests that feeling of that mirror-like image on a heated horizon. And Darren Waterston's Ice and Stars, unlike Dodge, paint here, it's almost like an enamel surface. It's so smooth, and he's really using tiny brushes. He's working from the Bible, particularly looking at the book of Revelations and notions of the apocalypse. This is part of a series of 5 landscapes that sort of take you sequentially through this end of time, more or less. And this cascading effect of just tiny strokes of light paint giving the effect of frost on a window. It looks as if the landscape is dissolving. While this is very much opaque and on the surface, you get the feeling that this one has all these layers of depth to it. As the trees that appear to melt become more and more faded as your eye goes back into the depths. Next slide. Pictorial surface is sculptural landscape arena. Next slide. What I wanted to do here was include works like this, that again, they don't have a traditional horizon line, you don't see traditional landscape or urban imagery, but there's something about the use of the surface in a way that made me think of topography, of natural terrain. As a matter of fact, in talking with Roger White, a West Coast artist, about his work, he is very much trying to almost transform his process from an artificial studio process to one where nature kind of takes over. He'll take marble dust and this material called asphaltum, which is sort of a tarry substance, and pigments, and what he'll do is he'll allow them to sit on canvases and cure and congeal and crack. And it's almost like time and dehydration, oxidation are all what shape his work. He doesn't know what they're going to look like. He sets these forces and materials together in motion, and it allows time and the elements to shape the final effect. And so you see what appears to be claw marks or maybe like a primitive tally. So you sense maybe the human hand is involved in some way, but at the same time it's so primal looking that it really has the feeling that nature's more the artist than man. And then over here, this work by Herb Creasy. Creasy was a fairly well-known abstract painter who was based in Atlanta. He did a show here at Ewing Gallery years ago while I was a student. I got a chance to meet him. And so again, when I came across his work in this estate where Robert Vanderbender's work was, I was thrilled to see it, and it was unlike anything of his I had seen. And what he's done is he's taken a square of wet plaster and has laid all kinds of objects into it at the bottom of a paint can. And, it's just almost like you're looking at a layer of fossilized debris that's been pulled up from underground. And he's a guy that had a pretty good sense of humor. When I look at this, I can't help but thinking, the first thing that came to mind was, okay, this is Herb, and that's his signature. Because you don't see a signature anywhere else. It's lowercase h. Is all I can think of when I see that. I probably ruined the work for you by saying that. That's what I see. Next slide. And then, speaking of abstraction and work that's all about the surface, we were so excited to have this work donated to us very recently. This painting was over at UN Gallery when I saw Tom McGrath's two landscapes, and Dottie Abel, the chair of the Department of Art over there, and Sam Yates, who runs UN Gallery, they both mentioned to David Butler and me that this artist was interested in donating this work to the museum. And I knew it was big, and when I walked over there, I was reminded just how large it was. Along with the Western Rim, the iceberg scene, I think this is the largest piece in our collection. It's one that really does sort of swallow you up. And there's a great story about this. Giles Lyon, I talked to him about the work because it's one that you look at and there's just so much going on. It's like, where do you start trying to figure this out? And what he told me was he was about to have his first sort of big New York show at Deitch Projects, which is a really pretty well-respected gallery. Deitch has since jumped out of the commercial gallery and is now working for a museum out on the West Coast. But back when he was running his gallery, he had offered to give Giles Lyon a solo show. And so Giles went in and looked at the space. He was sort of trying to get a sense of what am I going to do with this great opportunity. And Deitch had some monumental walls. And so Lyon said, you know what, this is the time for me to go big. I'm just going to see if I can create two gigantic canvases, have them at either end, and it'll be like anchors to the show. So he goes home, he buys canvas, he begins working. A couple of months before the show was supposed to open, Deitch representatives call him and say, we got to cancel the show. He was outraged. A lot of his friends walked away from the gallery because of that. He ended up selling the other large work that this was a pair with. But he kept this one around and worked on it for 12 years. And it wasn't until the UN Gallery show recently that this work came back to Knoxville, and then now we have it. But what he does is he starts out by basically cutting a large canvas, laying it on the ground, unstretched, while he's working on other things. And so this becomes literally a landscape for stains and shoe marks and who knows. He just allows all the activity from the studio to begin to give this a patina. And then once he gets it to a certain point, he brings it up, stretches it, and begins to paint on it by throwing paint in it, building up paint. He'll scrape paint off of his palette and literally embed it on. Matter of fact, right there, there's a chunk of paint that looks like a tree grew up and was cut off. You got these rings of paint. He's got shavings that are on there. There are big pieces of credit card. It's like literally a diary-like entry of the landscape of his studio life for 12 years. And he said that while things were happening in New York City, he would reflect on them and put them into the painting. Very loose entries, but the Twin Towers, I don't know if that's a reference, but he said there were definitely clear references to 9/11 in the painting. So much happened in his life and in the life of New York City during this time. This really is, again, a great diary-like work. But the way he likens this to a landscape, too, is he's very much interested in biological activity. He'll look at, say, the growth of a mushroom in nature, and he'll liken that growth to the growth of cities. And so he sees these almost like, again, big topographies, as if you're looking down, and there are all these sort of centers of activity and connectors, and then little satellites of growth, spores that have been sprinkled out here. And so all of these are things he's working with. There are times you think that you're seeing something maybe from an elevation view. There's even an actual figure right here who's kicking up into space. He's looking at comic books, and there are all kinds of references, but the landscape is certainly at the core of what he does. Next image. Method, material, and meaning. You could apply this to probably anything in the show, but if you go to the next slide, there were several works I wanted to talk about because they deal with, for the most part, recognizable imagery, but the way that it's been painted has a lot to do with what the artist is thinking about the subject. Like this work by Stephan Curtin called Welcome Back. Curtin will work from his own photographs or from photographs in fashion magazines, and typically what he does is he will take images of fashionable suburban life that represent some sort of an ideal, and he will paint that in a way where it feels empty, it feels shallow, it feels fragmented, it feels superficial.
Feels boring.
And the underlying surface here is gold spray paint, so it's almost like it's being held up like it's an icon or something. But if you look at the brushwork over here, nothing really connects, there's nothing substantial about it, and again, it's completely isolated, there's no sign of any human activity. Next image. Wolf Puder, artist based in Leipzig, Germany, where a number of really talented artists have been coming out of the last 10, 15 years. This is a painting called Baustopp, which means putting a moratorium on growth or progress or building. So it really sort of enhances the feeling that you get when you look at this, that this is a desolate scene, a place where things have gone wrong. And as a young painter working in Leipzig, he was aware, like many of his associates, that a lot of the towns in East Germany, after the fall, really experienced massive unemployment, depopulation, and so this is probably a pretty literal view of some places that he saw. What I really admire about his work is the way that he balances precision with chance and with allowing paint to sort of do what paint does when exposed to gravity. If you look at every line in this composition has been laid down with a straight edge. So there's that feeling of precision, feeling of an architect's hand. At the same time, there are areas where the paint is allowed to drip and pour, to build up in cakey areas. There are also areas where he's perfectly content to show you what the composition used to look like and sort of tracking his changes. You'll see, for instance, that before he decided to shorten the roof line of this structure, the roof actually extended out much further. And so all those earlier layers of paint, he doesn't make any effort to scrape them down. Something else about his way of working is that he's able to use this precise way of painting, but yet everything is a little bit out of kilter. He lines things up just so that they don't quite line up. He'll leave gaps between an upright and a support. It looks as if maybe an earthquake has just run through here. Part of this bridge has fallen out. And so through his technique, his choice of leaden colors, he's able to infuse the scene with the atmosphere that he's really trying to create. And at the same time, it's just a beautiful painting, just to get up close to it and look at the surface and his command of his materials. And this is one of the 3 works of art that our Collector Circle group got to consider. And it wasn't the top vote getter, but it got enough votes that went back to the group and were able to raise enough money, and so it's now ours. And we're really thrilled about having this as part of the collection. Next image. Another work we were able to raise money for, the 3rd piece that we were able to acquire, was this work by Zsolt Bodoni called Hall with Horses. Bodoni is a young Hungarian artist of Romanian heritage, and he, like a number of other young artists in this country, are looking back at the effects of communism, at the change in the country's identity during the communist regimes, and looking back at the country before communism, and the way in which there was all of this iconoclasm, where people from the communist regime were destroying earlier monuments from Hungary's distant past, and then replacing those with communist images. And then after the fall of communism, how democratic regimes are destroying all the communist monuments. And so what we see here is a large canvas of this shadowy foundry interior where there's a large crucible that would hold the melted bronze, and then here are bronze horses going back in the distance. They're being hung, awaiting placement, or perhaps they're being hung up, waiting to be melted down again. We're not sure at what stage of the process these are in. But one of the things I find really exciting about the way he paints is that there's such a sense of urgency. He's using a very large brush, probably 4 inches, and is laying the paint on with this haste that makes you think he's seen something important. He wants to communicate it to us before he runs out of time. I mean, that's the feeling you get. Like he can't sit there and take all day rendering every little detail, every little nuance. He's trying to record this information almost like the Ashcan School artists did around 1900 in New York City, where things were happening so fast they didn't have time to sit there and worry about every little hair on a dog's back. They were really trying to get the main part of the action captured convincingly, dynamically, and Bodoni really does that. Next image. The piece that was being considered by our collectors that was the top vote getter is this work by Gordon Chung, Fallen. Chung is a young London artist whose parents are from Hong Kong originally, and he grew up, was an adolescent at the time when the computer industry, technology, everything was going through the roof. It seemed like there was no end in sight. And then suddenly, within just a few years, there were major scandals and the dot-com implosion, and he realized sort of how artificial it all is and how unstable it all is. And so he began working with icons, for the most part, borrowed from Western mythology. The Marlboro Man, or a rodeo rider, or a bull, or a bear. A lot of times these are symbols for the economic markets. And one of the things he does is he chooses materials that are integral to what he's trying to say. He'll, in fact, paint this entire composition from the mountain range down on pieces of the London Financial Times. So this is basically sort of a pinkish newspaper. And if you see these sort of lines of texture, those are all the financial numbers, tiny numbers for all the different stocks and how they're performing. And so he paints on top of that in colors that are borrowed from advertising imagery. These are artificial Dago colors that you might expect on a billboard or a plastic cup, but certainly not in nature. And he's also using imagery borrowed from thermal imaging, where you're sort of seeing the parts of the body where the heat is greatest would be yellow or orange or red, and where it's the coolest it becomes green or blue. And so, again, the sort of filter of technology, pulling things away from visible nature into this artificial world. And then you've got this writer falling into a quagmire of built-up paint. And if you look at the mountain range up here, you might look at that and say, well, those mountains look a little unusual. In fact, what he's done is he's composed a lot of this on his computer as sort of a sketch, and then has found a way to transfer that onto the paper and onto the paint. And here what he's done is he's taken actual mountain imagery from a photograph and sort of photoshopped it, printed it onto some of the newsprint, added some color, and then cut it out in a way where these contours echo the ups and downs of a stock graph. So it's not a natural mountain range. So this is a completely synthetic environment that stands as an icon to the economic realities of the last couple of decades. Next slide. Next slide. So by disrupted relationship between the viewer and the subject, I wanted to include these drawings because in a lot of ways they're incredibly descriptive. If you look at the way he describes the texture of Rebecca's hair and the patterns of her dress, her blouse, if you look at the way he's describing certain plant forms, atomic blast, very carefully observed. But what he's done is he's taken drawing, because this is all done in drawing, and he's found a way to make it completely fragmented. It's almost like he's taken bits of imagery out of this massive archive, dropped them on the floor, and they've all sort of landed in various configurations. So if this work were delivered to you and you were given it as a present and it wasn't in a frame, you might wonder, what side is up? Where's the signature? And there's really, the orientation is completely off. We've got a tree coming up this way, she's standing here, Sir Walter Raleigh, whoever he is looking that way. One of the other things that's interesting about his approach to drawing is how many different techniques he's using. We define drawing here as any unique work on paper, so it's not just graphite or ink. Here he's got paint that he's actually scraped through with probably one of those trowels that you use to put down glue for a floor. He's allowed this tree, he's drawn it on the back of the paper with a ballpoint pen, and then used a solvent and applied it to the other side of the paper so that the ink bleeds through. He's using pen and ink, he's using pencil here, he's taped off certain areas, he's squeegee paint on in other areas. So again, lots of different techniques. It's sort of an encyclopedia of drawing methods. But again, you've got this imagery pulled from modern suburban life that's completely disjointed. There's no horizon line, no orientation that really anchors these compositions.
Steve,
Yes?
did he tell you which way to hang them?
He gave us a clue, and actually the gallery, they sent them down to us with the hardware oriented a certain way, so it was a great relief. You know, if they tell us whatever you want to do, that's fine too. I'd probably, as a curator, want to change the orientation periodically. But they did send it down with a specific orientation in mind.
Can I make a comment about Sprecher?
Sure.
When he was here doing his workshop, he said that piece we saw that's upstairs, it was originally the other way.
Ah.
And it also was backwards against the wall for a while. That's
Okay.
another thing he does.
Yeah, lets them sort of percolate. The
Yeah.
other thing is that it was hard to tell because the piece was so layered behind other imagery, but there's sort of a base shape behind everything else that was pulled from a very famous print by Albrecht Dürer called Melancholia 2. And it's this sort of unusual geometric, I'm not even sure, dodecahedron or something like that, but Jared, again, pulled things from lots of different sources and combined them in ways where the original recognition of that shape is lost. Next work. This is a work we just acquired by Patty Chang called The Extension of Nothing, Removing the Floor of the Pieces, #3. It was donated to us by a local collector who now lives in North Carolina, but is still very interested in helping us build our collection. And he's specifically interested in young performance-related artists, particularly women artists, and Chang fits that bill very well. She's often using herself, usually uses herself as the point of reference, sometimes her family members, and usually it's her doing something that deals with her body or with reflection, with liquids. There's one image of her I saw in a video that's really intriguing, where all you see is her face leaning down, and there's a mirror image of her face, and then that mirror image begins to disappear, and you realize what she's done is she's drinking liquid off of a reflective surface, and so as she's drinking it, her reflection goes away. And really clever work. And this is one where, in addition to film and performance, she does do still photographs. And this is one from a performance she did in a cathedral in Ghent, Belgium, where she has a camera placed in a way where the reflection we see doesn't reveal its location. I don't think she's doing any sort of photoshopping, but I'm not sure about that. And we're sort of forced into the position of voyeur. We're forced to look up her dress. At the same time, we're looking down at her in a way where we don't get to see her at all. So in terms of, if you take the reflection out of the picture, this photograph doesn't really tell us much about her, but yet through her reflection, which is this distancing mechanism, we see much more than perhaps we want to. And she's, again, I think playing with relationships between architecture and the human body. When you're looking up her dress, and if you just rotate over, you've got sort of a similar cross right here with what's called a groin vault. And so I think she's aware of all these things and is just having fun with them. And as with the work I just quoted earlier, this is a large reflective surface on which she's poured out liquid and allows it to form this beautiful mirror. And you see the wrinkles on her feet. And so this is one of the few works in our collection that deal with work by women performance artists, and we're expecting another couple to come in from this artist soon. So this is an area I think will grow largely because of one person's effort to help us. Next slide. So just to sort of sum up, Uncertain Terrain is an exhibition that's drawn from our collection, but during the course of this show, because of the way we did it, we ended up coming away with 3 works of art and maybe more because we have integrated acquisitions opportunities into our collection exhibitions. It really gave people a chance to bond with these works over a long time and to gauge how well they fit with our existing collection. My hope was that people saw this old Puder work next to Jared Sprecher's work or Giles Lyon's work, they'd say, these really work very well together. They complement one another. These works add new energy, and the KMA collection has taken a step forward because of the show. So we're hoping that every time we do a collection show, we'll have this kind of progress to report. And I guess with that, I'll go ahead and close.